بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين أجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف وجعلنا من أعوانه وأنصاره اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني بنور الفهم اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Alhamdulillah, we have tawfiq to study another book by the late Ayatullah Mutahhari. This is a small short book by Ayatullah Mutahhari which initially was written by him as a contribution to a collection of articles for celebrating the beginning of the 15th century, so 1400 years after the Bi'tha of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So some ulama and some academics contributed to a collection which was called Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam Khatam Piyambaran, about Prophet being the seal of the prophets. Allama Tabatabai also had contribution, so some other scholars. So this was first published around 1968. So around that time, and then during his life it was published separately, and then after his martyrdom this has been published again and again. The edition that I am using is the 20th, but must be many times more again published. So, the idea for writing this book was to clarify some misunderstandings, because some people wanted to use this as a way to criticize the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he was illiterate. So we will inshallah see what was the reason behind this, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who prepared his prophet for his great task, why didn't have in his plan that he goes to a school, or indeed why in his plan it was that he should not go to a school and he should not read or write. This will be inshallah explained. So we have important discussions which also help us to understand history of Islam and pre-Islam era, also something about the culture of that time. So there are some other side topics that we will inshallah discuss. So he says one of the clear points about the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that he didn't go to any school and he didn't have any teacher and he didn't read any book or write any books or write letters. And he says no one among historians, whether Muslims or non-Muslims, has claimed that he had gone to the school or he had a teacher or he wrote something. No, this is something that it's very clear for the period before Islam. Inshallah, we will discuss in more details about the period after Islam, because after Islam, some people say that he didn't write, but he read. But we will talk about this. Ayatullah Mutahhari, the conclusion is that even after Islam, he didn't read and he didn't write. So, those who were saying that the Prophet was taught by someone else, for example, someone who was aware of the biblical and, for example, other sources, they never say that the Prophet went to the, for example, a school or read the books. The maximum they claim is that it was a kind of oral communication. And Quran, refutes this idea. Inshallah, we will talk about it. That, first of all, there is no record that anyone was teaching the Prophet. And the one that they were accusing was not speaking Arabic. And Quran is very clear and eloquent Arabic. But I'm saying that even those who wanted to say that the Prophet had a teacher, they don't say that it was through reading a text or writing. They say orally. He learned from that. He refers to some Western writers, for example, Carlyle, in his book Al-Abtal, means heroes. He says that we should not forget that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't take any lesson from any teacher, and actually the skill of writing had just started among Arabs. Inshallah, we'll talk more about this. He says that my idea is that he was not familiar with writing, and he just got his lessons of life from desert, but he was not in any school. Will Durant, in the History of Civilization, he says no one decided to teach the Prophet writing or reading. So among the family members, no one undertook this task or planned for that, because he says in that time it was not important for Arabs to read or write. He says in the whole Quraysh tribe, there were about 17 people, the whole tribe, 17 people only who were able to read and write. And he says, but it is interesting that the most eloquent Arabic book, meaning Quran, was coming through the tongue of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He refers also to other writers, and one of them, who is Constant Virgil Giorgio, he says that although the Prophet was Ummi, but the very first verses which were communicated to him was about writing. And for example, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق, اقرأ وربك الأكرم. Yeah? Or for example, we have الذي علم بالقلم. So reading, pen, or nun wal qalam وما يسرون. Great emphasis is put in the Quran on reading, writing, but this was not part of the culture of that time. And he says, in no religion so much emphasis is put on knowledge. And he says, I congratulate Muslims that their religion so much emphasizes on ma'rifah. Gustav Le Bon, also in Islamic and Arab civilization, he says, it is well known that he was illiterate, and then he has some ideas, but in any case he says that he was at the maximum of intelligence, but he was not reading and writing. So Ayatullah Mutahhari said the reason we refer to these people is that because if there was something that could suggest that the Prophet was able to read and write or he went to a school, they would have picked up. Even, for example, some people used just one incident to say that maybe Prophet, for example, learned from someone else. You all know that during some of the trade trips that the Prophet had, and when he was going with his uncle, Hazrat Abu Talib, in one manzil, one station, they met a Christian monk called Buhayra. And some people paid attention to this trip and found maybe this is a place that we can say maybe the Prophet learned from this Christian monk, because there was no one in Mecca that they could say he taught the Prophet. But this is not based on any evidence. Indeed, Louis Massignon, he says that this story is whole baseless, and he says there is no evidence to support this. So we need to discuss this topic in two different periods. Before the Prophet was raised and appointed as a prophet, so means the first 40 years, and then after he was appointed as a prophet, so the next 23 years. So we need to discuss both periods of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, among all people, Muslims, whether Sunni, Shia, non-Muslim, there is agreement that before Islam, in the first 40 years, the Prophet didn't read and didn't write. Quran, as you know, says, "Ma kunta tatlu min qablihi min kitab, wa la takhutuhu biyaminik." Before Quran, you were not reading anything or writing anything. إِذَنْ لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. Otherwise, those who are after falsehood would have raised doubt, would have put themselves into doubt. Irtiyab means when there is no basis, but someone doesn't want to accept, says, I doubt. So, before Islam, there is no disagreement. After Islam, in the last 23 years of the life of the Prophet, from some Shia hadiths, we can suggest that the Prophet was, reading sometimes. But this is not very clear. There are some texts that suggest this. But as I said, his own overall conclusion is even after Islam, the Prophet was not reading. We will argue for that. We will show some evidence. Okay? So before Islam, there is no doubt. After Islam, when it comes to reading, some Shia hadith suggest that the Prophet was reading, but not writing. Now, let us first have a quick review of the history of emergence of writing in Arabic language and among Arabs. You know that overall, Arabs of that time were very much interested in their language. They were at the peak of, eloquence, but for them, writing was not an issue. The main thing was, oral, to poetry or speaking, and they had very good memories. They were able, to memorize, many poems, or when even Quran came, there were many memorizers of the Quran. Although, there were not many people who were experienced or, who had, techniques of memorization. There were not schools of memorization. But they had such a beautiful, memory that they could memorize easily. And as you know, although the Quran also very much talks about writing, and it is also called, kitab, but Quran also, the best experience that you can make with the Quran is if you recite it, not just, read it as a text. Means you have to listen it also. Yeah, it's something that is communicated through ears as well, not just, reading it like a text. Some of the text doesn't make difference whether you read them or recite them and make yourself, listen. So, Baladhari, in a very famous book, Futuhul Buldan. Futuhul Buldan is conquest of the lands. So, he has a section towards the end of his book about emergence of khat, writing, among Arabs in Hijaz. He says, first, 3 people from the tribe of Tai, the same tribe of Hatam Ta'i, Tai, who were near Sham. So they were in Hijaz, but near borders of Sham. These people were the first people who invented Arabic writing. They were using some comparisons with, Syriac to make, new Arabic alphabet and handwriting. Then some people from Anbar in Iraq, they learned from these people. Then some people from Hira learned from those people in Anbar. So little by little, this was a spread. Then one of them went to Mecca, and Sufyan ibn Umayyah, the uncle of Abu Sufyan, learned. Abu Qubays ibn Abd Manaf also learned. So you see, it's just maybe one generation before the Prophet that in Mecca some people started learning how to read. It's a very, very new invention. Then Besh with 2 people went to Ta'if for trade and taught some people there. Then some people learned and went to Egypt. So little by little, writing started to spread. This is what Baladhari says in Futuhul Buldan. Ibn Nadim, who is very famous kind of author for biographies, especially for writing index. His Al-Fihrist, like index, is very famous. He was from the 4th century. So he has also reference to some of the things that Baladhari said, but he also quotes Ibn Abbas that the first people who wrote Arabic language were 3 people from Anbar, from a tribe in Anbar. And then the people of Hira learned from them. Ibn Khaldun also reports what Baladhari said and supports that. So it seems that it's something that other scholars of earlier centuries also accepted and endorsed. Baladhari says that when Islam emerged, in the advent of Islam, in the whole Mecca, only 17 people were able to write, including Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, alayhi salam, Uthman ibn Affan, Abu Ubaidiyya Jarrah, Talha, and other people. And there was one Qurayshi lady, a Sayyida from Quraysh, a lady from Quraysh, that just at that time of emergence of Islam, advent of Islam, was able to read and write. Her name was Shifa, daughter of Abdullah al-Adwi, and she became a Muslim and is one of the first people who migrated. She is the one who taught Hafsa how to, write. And then after Islam, some other Muslim women also learned. It is interesting that it was possible and open, and there was no restriction for Muslim women to learn. Then Belazari says that in Medina there were some people who were like writers for the Prophet. And he says in Medina, when Islam started, before the Prophet established community there were only 11 people from Aus and Khazraj. We said 17 people in Mecca. In Yathrib, which became Medina, only 11 people from Aus and Khazraj were able to read and write. And he mentions their names. So, if Rasulullah was a person who was reading and writing before Islam, it would be certainly picked up, because all those people are named by their details. And someone like Rasulullah, if he was one of them, everyone would know. So, for the period before Islam, it's very clear. But after Islam, as I said, there is some discussion. And Ayatullah Mutahhari says, considering all the factors and evidence, we can say even after Islam, he didn't read and write. Although in some hadith of the Shia, there is reference to Prophet, maybe was reading. One hadith is mentioned by the late Sheikh Saduq, Rizwanullah Ta'ala alayh, in Ilal al-Shara'i. Sheikh Saduq was one of our great scholars, especially in the field of fiqh and hadith. He compiled Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih, which is one of our first 4 collections of hadith, Kutub Arba'ah. And he has many other books. Actually, it is mentioned that he was born with the dua of Imam Mahdi Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Farajah, because his father was a scholar and had no child, and sent a message through Naib of Imam that Imam prays for him. So one of his books is Ilal al-Shara'i. Ilal al-Shara'i is dedicated to hadith which explain the reason behind legislation of some of the rulings. Okay, whether it's about tahara, about salat, about other, furu' ad-din. So, one hadith is this. And this hadith is according to the edition that Ayatullah Mutahhari used on the page 133 of Ilal al-Shara'i. Basically, the hadith says that one of the blessings of Allah for the Prophet was that he was able to read, but he was not writing. So, when Abu Sufyan planned to go towards Uhud, Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, wrote a letter and sent to the Prophet. And when the Prophet received this letter from his uncle, informing him that Abu Sufyan is moving towards Uhud, Prophet was in one of the gardens in the outskirts of Medina. And he wrote the letter but didn't inform his companions. And he said everyone should go to the city. And then in the city, he informed them about what his uncle had reported to him. Okay? So, if you go by the Zahir, by the, apparent meaning, it suggests that the Prophet read himself the letter of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet. Okay? But we find this incident reported in another way also. For example, in some Seerah books, it says that when he received the letter from his uncle, he opened the seal and asked Ubay ibn Ka'b to read. And when he read for the Prophet said, don't say to anyone anything about this. Okay? So, you see, there is conflicting report here. Some people are reported also by Sayyid Murtaza Rizwanullah Ta'ala alayhi, Alamul Huda, brother of Sayyid al-Razi who compiled Nahj al-Balagha. He says some people like Sha'bi, they had this idea that the Prophet was able to read and write, although he didn't go to school. This is not a Shia view, but Sayyid Murtaza himself also wants to support that. The incident that he refers to is a different incident. It's not the letter of the uncle of the Prophet. It's the famous story of Thursday, the last Thursday of the life of the Prophet, the story of ink and paper. Okay? So, the Prophet told them to bring some ink and something to use as like a pen to write something that they will not go astray. Sayyid Murtaza says, he said, bring something to write for you, something that you would not go astray. So it means that he wanted to write himself. But Ayatullah Mutahhari says, this is not very, clear. Maybe the Prophet meant, I will dictate for you and you write it yourself. So it is possible that when I dictate and someone writes, to say that, bring this so that I write for you something. Although maybe al-ma'na al-zahiri is what Sayyid Murtaza says, but it is not very explicit. In ilm usul we say we have nas and zahir. Nas means it's very clear, there is no other way to understand it. But the zahir means there are two, at least, interpretations. One is the one that comes to your mind first, but it's not that explicit that you cannot interpret it another way. So when we have lots of evidence that the Prophet was not reading and writing, just one hadith, the zahir of one hadith, is not able to stand. The next discussion, again, about period after Islam, is about those who were writing for the Prophet. His, scribes, his writers, or in Arabic we say dabir. Dabir is the one who writes. Now, in Farsi for secretariat, we say dabir khane. Okay, so this is very old and established term. Rasulullah in Medina had some people who were responsible for writing different things. And this is interesting that although the culture was not culture of writing, but Islam so much emphasizes on writing and documenting. We have lots of hadith about documenting. قَيِّدُ الْعِلْمِ بِالْكِتَابِ. So these people were responsible for writing letters that the Prophet was sending, contracts, or for example, if there were transactions between people, buying, selling, different things they were writing. Or if people were paying, khums, zakat, so they were writing them and registering them. Muhammad ibn Sa'd in At-Tabaqatul Kabir has registered 100 letters of the Prophet. One of our contemporary scholars who was teaching us also, and I benefited from him a lot, Ayatullah Mutahhari, rahmatullah alayhi. He did great work and tried to collect all the letters of the Prophet, called Makatibur Rasul. Makatib, the plural for maktub. So in 3 volumes, Ayatullah Mutahhari collected the letters of Rasulullah. It's amazing that these letters were registered and remained. So, if he was writing to the kings, to the, for example, Roman emperor, etc., Iranian king, these letters were written. The Prophet was dictating, they were writing for him. And also, he says that, Ayatullah Mutahhari says, one also pattern that started from that time was that the one who was writing was putting his name at the end. So not only the Prophet name was there as the one who dictated, but the writer was also mentioned. This is very good for accuracy. The first person that started this practice is Ubay ibn Ka'b, the famous companion of the Prophet. So we have so many letters from the Prophet. The name of the writers are also mentioned. In none of them you find that the Prophet was the writer. Or for example, there were people who were responsible for writing the Quran. Okay? But we don't have any passage from the Quran that was written by the Prophet. For sure, if the Prophet was going to write something, he would have written Quran. But he didn't write even Quran. Ya'qubi, in the 2nd volume of his history, mentions some of these writers for Rasulullah. He says, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Uthman ibn Affan, Amr ibn al-As, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and other people. These were people who were writing. Mas'udi in At-Tanbih wal-Ashraf, he says that, or wal-Ashraf, he says that each of them had different tasks. For example, Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As was someone who was mostly available and writing, miscellaneous things. Mughayrat ibn Shu'bah, Hasin ibn Namir, also similar. But Abdullah ibn Arqam, Ala ibn Aqaba, they were writing documents for people and transactions, etc. Zubayr ibn al-Awam, Juhaym ibn Salt, they were writing taxes and sadaqat. So, different people had different tasks. Zayd ibn Sabit al-Ansari was writing the letters to the kings and rulers, and he was also mutarjim, translator for the Prophet. He knew Farsi, Roman, Coptic, and Ethiopian languages. Even it is interesting that the Prophet asked him to learn Hebrew. And he says in half a month he learned how to write Hebrew. I don't know what a great memory he had, So in Jami of Tirmidhi, Zayd ibn Sabit says, Rasulullah told me to learn Hebrew, and he said about half a month I learned, and then whenever Prophet wanted to write to the Jews, I was writing for him. Muawiyah, only for few months before the demise of the Prophet, was also writing, was one of the writers. We have also many cases that people went to see the Prophet, sometimes from near places, sometimes from far places, and asking for advice. And these were written also by these writers. But we don't have any place that Rasulullah himself wrote for them an advice. We have, for example, advice from Amirul Mu'minin written by him, but we don't have anything written by Rasulullah himself. Then he says something very interesting from Ibn Nadim. Please remember, Ibn Nadim was in the 4th century. Okay? More than 1,000 years ago. He says something, and he was not a Shia, but he says, I came to know one of the Shia of Kufa, whose name was Muhammad ibn al-Husayn, known as Ibn Abi Ba'rah. Amazing. This is 4th century. He said, this Shia from Kufa had a library, and I had not seen like that. And he had received it from another Shia in Kufa. And he says, what was astonishing was that in every book or paper, it was written who had written it. The name of the writer, not the author. The writer's name was also there. And he says, also there were testimonies of some of the scholars that they verified that yes, this is correct. And he says, over there I saw writings of Imam Hassan, he says Hassan ibn Ali, and Hussein ibn Ali. This is in the 4th century. And also he says, I saw documents and treaties with the handwriting of Ali ibn Abi Talib. So it's amazing that these things were available. So when there was even, like a library, why there is nothing, even one piece of paper that Rasulullah is considered to be the writer? So, for sure, he didn't write anything. Whether he read, we don't have evidence, but we cannot, also say, Wallahi, he didn't read, because it's not that clear. The next thing that we discuss for today, and this is very important also incident, is the peace treaty of Hudaybiyyah, Sulh Hudaybiyyah. As you know, in the years 6 after Hijrah, okay, Rasulullah and some Muslims traveled towards Mecca to perform Hajj after 6 years of leaving Mecca. And Rasulullah very much loved Mecca and Masjidul Haram. He had very special connection. So he wanted to go and perform Hajj. But when they reached only about 2 farsakh, about like 11, 12 kilometers before they arrive in Mecca, Quraysh leaders decided to stop them. And although it was month of Haram, and they should not have gone for fighting, whatever. They should have let them go, but they didn't let them. The Prophet said, we don't have any intention except performing a Hajj, and after Hajj we quickly return. But they said no. Some Muslims, we say more Catholics than the Pope, so we have more Muslims, they are more, passionate than the Prophet. Some Muslims said, no, we should fight and go. The Prophet said no. So they wrote a kind of treaty. And Rasulullah thought we should not fight and Kaaba must be respected. So we write a treaty. Rasulullah said to Amirul Mu'mineen to write. So he was dictating to Amirul Mu'mineen. And he said, write, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Suhail ibn Amr, who was representative of Quraysh, he said, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is your motto. We are not familiar with that. Just write, Bismika Allahumma. Rasulullah said, okay. Then Rasulullah said to Amir al-Mu'minin, write that this is a contract between Quraysh and Muhammad Rasulullah, the messenger of God. This Suhail said, we don't recognize you as messenger of God. Just write Muhammad ibn Abdullah. If we believe that you are messenger of God, we would not be fighting you. We don't believe that you are messenger of God. Rasulullah said, whether you accept or not, I am messenger of God, but ask Amirul Mu'mineen to write as they say. He didn't insist that it should write Muhammad Rasulullah. Some Muslims became very upset and they said, no, we should not change. So now we go into some detailed reports, because here there is something important about whether there is a chance to argue that the Prophet was able or was exercising reading and writing or not. So, according to Sirayya ibn Hisham and Sahih Bukhari, when Rasulullah said, write, this is between Muhammad Rasulullah and Quraysh, before it was written, they objected. Okay? So, nothing was written. And Rasulullah said, okay, write Muhammad ibn Abdullah. But this is Sirayya ibn Hisham and Sahih Bukhari. According to most of sources, Amirul Mu'minin had already written Muhammad Rasulullah. Okay? So, Rasulullah asked him to wipe Rasulullah. Amirul Mu'minin apologized, said, I cannot do this. And Rasulullah said, I will do it myself. Okay? Now, according to Shia hadith, Prophet himself removed it, wiped it, and then Amirul Mu'minin wrote Ibn Abdullah. So he said, show me where is Rasul, and he removed it. And in some hadith, it says that Rasulullah asked, show me where is the word, and Ali showed, and then he did it. In Qisas Quran, which is very old Farsi, tafsir of the Quran from the 5th century, says that it's in an old Farsi style, that Rasul sallallahu alayhi goft mar Ali ra ke Rasulullah bemahai. We don't speak like this now. Bemahai mahf kon. Wipe out. Ali ra az dil bar nayamad ke Rasulullah bemahudi. He didn't feel, in his heart that he can do this. رسول صلی الله علیه گفت انگشت من بران نه تا من به مهایم. Rasul said, put my finger on that so that I do it myself. زان که رسول صلی الله علیه امی بود، نبشته ندانستیم. He says because he was ummi, he was not writing. In Sahih Muslim it says, Rasulullah said to Imam Ali, فَأَرْنِي مَكَانَهَا, show me the place of it. فَأَرَاهُ مَكَانَهَا. Then Ali alayhi salam showed him, and فَمَحَاهَا وَكَتَبَ ibn Abdullah. There is one technical thing here. So far, everything is clear. In some texts, when it says that Rasulullah, removed this term, then there is kataba. أخذه Rasulullah wa kataba, and wrote. They say, look, some people say, look, Rasulullah wrote himself. He asked Imam Ali to show him, and he removed, then he wrote himself. But Ayatullah Mutahhari says, no, this kataba refers to Amirul Mu'mineen. It means Rasulullah removed, and Ali alayhi salam then, after he removed his name, put Ibn Abdullah. So, this is at most just something that is ambiguous, or it carries different possibilities. And we say, إِذَا جَاءَ الْإِحْتِمَالِ بَطَلَ الْإِسْتِدْلَالِ. When something can be understood differently, you cannot use it as a proof. You have to find a case that there is no other explanation than Rasulullah himself writing. In Ustul Ghaba, which is about companions of the Prophet, there is a story which is about one of the companions of the Prophet. His name was Tamim ibn Jurashah al-Thaqafi. This story is very interesting. He says, with some people from my tribe, we went to the Prophet and we embraced Islam. But we wanted to have a written document, agreement with Rasulullah. So to embrace Islam, they wanted some kind of document. And not as a certificate, something that they wanted to negotiate with the Prophet. That with these terms, we have become Muslims. So that later people don't expect from them more than that. So, when they embraced Islam, they said to the Prophet, we have some conditions. Rasulullah said, write down your conditions and bring to me. Okay, so he wanted them to write it clearly so that there is no change. He says, we had two conditions to write. We wanted Rasulullah to allow us that after we become Muslim, we can still take riba and do zina. Strange people. So, to take usury and be able to have fornication. This was part of, their culture. For them was difficult. But they were not able to write themselves. They went to Imam Ali. When Imam Ali heard our conditions, he said, I don't write it. So they went to Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As. Imam Ali told Khalid, do you know what they want you to write? He said, it's not of my business. I write it down, then Rasulullah decides. So he wrote for them, and they took it to Rasulullah. Then Rasulullah asked someone to read. When he reached the one who was reading, Reba, Rasulullah said, according to this report, put my hand and finger on it. Then, he removed it. And he said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullah wa dharu ma baqiya min ar-riba. Because, legislation of prohibition of many things came gradually. So ayah was revealed at some point that now leave it. Whatever riba you had in the past, okay, but now stop. But they say when we heard this ayah from Rasulullah, it gave us strength and we were happy. And then when they reached the second condition about zina, Rasulullah again asked to put his finger on it, and he said, La taqrabu zina, innahu kana fahisha. And then he removed it. This story also shows that Rasulullah asked someone to read and said, put my finger on it. Okay? So, there is no report that he was reading or writing. Maybe he was, of course, I think it's very plausible to say that if he wanted to read, he was able to, use ilmul ghaib. But he didn't want to use ilmul ghaib because they use ilmul ghaib when there is maslaha, when there is wise reason. Here, wisdom required actually not to know and not to read, because there is a plan of Allah that he should not read and write. Yeah? If plan of Allah required another thing, then that was different. Like what? Like about poem. Rasulullah was very eloquent, but he never made poem, and he never even read poems made by others. Even if he was going to refer to a poem, he was always breaking down the poem. So, changing the order of the words. Because Quran says, Ma allamnahu shi'ra wa ma yanbaghi lah. We don't teach him, we didn't teach him poem, and it's not suitable for the Prophet. Because then some people could say, he is a poet, he is using, the power of literature, etc. So, everything in the life of the Prophet, even before Islam, was carefully planned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah says to Musa alayhi salam that I made you for myself, istana'tuka li nafsi. Yeah? Allah says to Musa, I made you for myself. Or letusna'a ala aini, so that you can be built, in my eyes. So Allah has a plan for Musa alayhi salam. From the time he was born, everything was planned. Of course, this doesn't contradict their free will. For Rasulullah, the same. If he became orphan, it's not by accident. He had to endure lots of hardship. Okay, he lost his father, his mother, uncle, grandfather, wife. All the sufferings, all the issues, his trade experiences, marriage to Lady Khadija, all are to prepare him for this great task. If he was required to read and write, Allah would have planned for him that way. But actually the plan was against that. The plan of Allah was that he should not read and write. Although even Imam Ali, who was under his tarbiyah, was able to read and write, because he was not receiving wahi. No one said Amirul Mu'minin received wahi. But Rasulullah was going to receive wahi, so he had to be very original and leave no doubt for anyone. Inshallah, we continue this discussion, bi'iznillah, next week and finish the book, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. So, I think we have a little break and then we can receive your questions, inshallah.